Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on the quantitative methodology chapter. And just before we get into the presentation, I'd like to present this information in case you are interested in additional assistance outside of this webinar. So we do provide assistance with all aspects of the dissertation. So if you are interested in more one-on-one support outside of this webinar, you can use the information that you see here to contact us and learn more about the types of assistance that we provide. And just to give an overview of what we're going to be talking about today, this presentation is going to be on the quantitative methodology chapter. So we will not be talking about qualitative or mixed method research today. We do have other webinars that are geared towards those topics. And first, we're just going to start off by talking about the purpose of the methodology chapter and why it's important to the dissertation. And then the majority of the presentation is going to focus on the different components required for the methodology chapter. So we'll talk about the introduction, research design, population sample and instrumentation, data collection procedures, and analysis procedures, limitations, and ethical considerations. And then at the end, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions. So you may type your questions into the questions section. And if there are any questions that aren't answered over the course of the presentation, at the end of the presentation, we will go through the questions and I'll answer them as best as I can. So first, let's talk about the purpose of the methodology chapter and why it's important. So the methodology chapter is designed to describe how you're going to be conducting your research. The previous chapters of the dissertation, so namely the introduction and literature review chapters, are geared towards establishing why your research is important and why your research needs to be conducted. Once you get to the methodology chapter, it's time to start talking about how you are going to conduct your research. So how are you going to answer the research questions and hypotheses that you've set out for your study? How are you going to address your problem purpose or research aims? And the main thing to keep in mind with the methodology chapter is that it should be detailed enough so that your research can be replicated by others. So somebody should be able to read your methodology chapter and be able to conduct the study in the exact same way that you did. So you can think of the methodology chapter almost like as an instruction manual. So you are writing an instruction manual that lays out all of the steps and directions for how to conduct your research study that someone else could be able to read and follow and be able to produce the exact same study. Others will liken the methodology chapter to a recipe where you have different components or ingredients like the participants and the instrumentation, and you have a set of procedures for putting all those things together, like how you're going to recruit the participants, how you're going to administer the instruments, and analyze the data, and so on, in a recipe step-by-step like fashion. And another thing to keep in mind is that while this presentation will be covering the components that are most typical for the methodology chapter based on our experience with many different schools, it's important to check your own school's specific guidelines to determine exactly what needs to go in your methodology chapter. So each school may have different requirements. Some schools may require more sections than what we cover in this presentation. Some schools may require less. Some schools may want the sections organized differently than how we present them here. So you really want to make sure that when in doubt, you defer to your school or degree program specific guidelines for constructing your methodology chapter. So now let's talk about the different components of the chapter, starting with the introduction. So like the other chapters of the dissertation, you usually start the methodology chapter with a brief introduction where you reorient the reader to your problem, purpose, and research questions, and then you preview the different sections of the chapter. So you can start by just restating your problem or purpose statement, and this can be done either a verbatim, copy and paste from your purpose statement as it's previously displayed in your dissertation, or it can be an abbreviated version of your purpose statement. And then you want to restate your research questions and hypotheses. And you want to make sure that your research questions and hypotheses always appear with the exact same wording whenever they appear in your document. So the wording of the research questions and hypotheses should never change. And then after you present that information, you can just preview the different sections of the methodology chapter, and this can be as simple as just listing out the different section headings that will appear in the chapter. So one of the first things that you usually talk about in the methodology chapter after your introduction is discussion of the research design. So here you'll need to explain what research design you selected and provide rationale for your selection of that research design. It's worth noting that depending on your school or degree program's requirements for the chapter, you may also need to discuss the more general research method, which would be the selection of a quantitative design. So if you're attending this webinar, it's assumed that you are probably doing a quantitative study. The research design is the specific design within quantitative that you select, but sometimes schools will also have you discuss the selection of the general research method, which would be quantitative, qualitative, or mixed method. So you may need to discuss your selection and rationale for picking a quantitative method, as well as the specific quantitative research design. So in this section, you'll want to state the research design you selected. And so in quantitative, this could be correlational design, experimental design, quasi-experimental, causal comparative. Those are just some examples of potential research designs within quantitative that you might choose. And you want to explain why you selected this design. So you want to provide rationale for why this was the most appropriate type of design for your study. And you want to frame it in terms of your problem, purpose, and research questions and hypotheses. So you want to be able to make the case that this design was the most appropriate for answering your problem, purpose, and research questions. So for instance, maybe you're doing a correlational study, and perhaps you're doing a correlational study because your research questions have to do with looking at relationships between variables. So that would be appropriate for a correlational design. And in addition to explaining why your selected design was appropriate to answer your research questions, you may also need to explain why other designs were not as appropriate. So if you selected a correlational design, you may need to discuss why an experimental design or a quasi-experimental design were not appropriate research designs for your study. So perhaps you didn't pick an experimental design because it's not possible for you to manipulate the independent variables, or maybe it's not possible for you to randomly assign participants to conditions to test some sort of experimental effect. So those might be reasons why you would select correlational instead of experimental. And again, if you need to discuss the general research method, so provide rationale for why quantitative was the most appropriate research method for your study, and then also explain why qualitative and mixed methods were not appropriate for your study. So now let's talk about the population and the sample. And this is an area where students often get confused. They sometimes use these terms interchangeably or don't really clearly understand the difference between the population and sample, but these are two different things, and it's important to distinguish between them. So starting with the population is the broad group of individuals or people that your results are intended to generalize to. So in other words, the population is the larger group of people that your study is about. So let's say you are doing a study in education, and maybe you plan to send out a survey to teachers. So maybe your population of interest might be, for instance, high school teachers in the United States. Or maybe it's not high school teachers, maybe it's university professors, or maybe it's middle school teachers, maybe it's kindergarten teachers. Because if your population is that specific, you want to specify that as your population of interest. It's really just the larger group of people that your study will be about. So in your population section, you will want to state what the population of interest is. So for example, that might be high school teachers in the United States could potentially be your population. And then you want to describe the characteristics of that population and provide an estimate of the population size if possible. So if you're doing that study on high school teachers in the United States, maybe you want to provide some statistics on, an estimate for how many high school teachers there are in the United States. You might get this information from some source like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or maybe a similar organization that collects statistics on these types of topics. Sometimes that data may not be precisely available to you, but you want to give your best estimate that you can to sufficiently describe your population of interest. So the population is different from the sample because the sample are specifically the individuals that you will select from the population who actually end up participating in your study. So your sample consists of only those individuals from the population who end up being in your study as participants. And so you can think of the difference between the sample and the population in terms of a fishing analogy. So let's say you are planning to go to a lake to go fishing. It's unlikely that when you go to the lake, you'll be able to catch every single fish that lives in the lake. You'll probably be lucky to just catch a few of the fish in the lake. And so you can think of the population as being all of the fish that live in the lake, and your sample is just the few fish that you end up catching when you go out on your fishing trip. And so when you talk about your sample, you want to go into detail about your sampling strategy or technique and your exact procedures for how you are going to select and recruit individuals from the population to be in your sample. Again, you want this to be as detailed as possible so that someone else could read these procedures and be able to replicate what you do. So, let's go back to our example of high school teachers. So let's say we're doing our study on high school teachers in the United States. And we need to get, some sample of high school teachers in the United States to participate in our study. And, for our purposes, let's just say that we're doing a simple survey study where we're having the participants fill out a survey. So you need to think about how are you going to invite high school teachers into your study and get them to participate? Well, one way to do that would be through some kind of random sampling process. In a true random sample, every individual in the population would have an equal opportunity to be selected into your study. However, if your population is just high school teachers in the United States, it's pretty unlikely in a dissertation study that you're going to be able to get a true random sample from a population that's that broad. It's more likely you'll have to do some kind of convenience sampling or non-probability sampling technique. And convenience sampling just means that you select individuals from the population based on what is available or convenient to you. So maybe in order to get a sample of high school teachers, you're going to go into a couple of local high schools and give out invitations to teachers in those schools. Or maybe you're going to go online and find some kind of teachers group or teachers association that high school teachers are members of, and maybe contact the administrator of that group and see if they'll send out invitations to the group members. So those are different ways that you could go about recruiting participants, but you want to be specific in how you're going to actually go in and deliver invitations and recruit people into your study. So if you're going into the local high schools, are you going to be, talking to the principals and getting the teachers' contact information from the principals? Are you just going to be going into the school and handing out the surveys to teachers or giving them a link to a survey that they can complete online? So how are you going to get their contact information so that you can inform them about the study and get them to participate? And then once you've thoroughly described your recruitment procedures, you will want to also calculate and state your target sample size. So for a quantitative study, you will likely want to use something called a power analysis to calculate the sample size that's going to be appropriate for the statistical analysis that you plan to do to answer your research questions. And I won't go into a whole lot of detail about power analysis in this presentation, just because we do have other webinars that are specifically dedicated to power analysis and sample size calculation. So if you are interested in more details on that topic, I would refer you to our other webinars specifically about power analysis. So now let's talk about the instrumentation. So in the instrumentation section, you will want to describe the instruments that you're using to measure each variable as they are laid out in your problem purpose and research questions and hypotheses. So by the end of the instrumentation section, you should have a description of how each variable that's listed in your research questions is going to be measured. Now, in the social sciences, when we think about instrumentation, we usually think about things like survey instruments. So maybe you have a survey instrument that measures, teacher self-efficacy, or maybe you have an instrument that measures self-esteem, or maybe some kind of psychological construct like anxiety or depression, where people fill or answer survey questions to assess and measure those variables. That's the most common form of instrumentation that we usually talk about in this kind of section, but there are other forms of instrumentation that exist as well. So if you're doing something more along the lines of, say, biomedical research, and you're actually doing physical measurements of things like height, weight, blood pressure, things like that, then you might have other types of instruments that measure those things. So you might measure blood pressure using a specific type of blood pressure monitor, or you might measure someone's weight using a specific type of scale. So those can also be instruments, and those need to be described in detail in your study if you're using those types of instruments. But for the purposes of the rest of this discussion, we'll be focusing mainly on survey instruments. So for each instrument, you will want to state what the instrument is. And if it's a survey instrument, you will want to describe the details of the instrument, such as how many items or questions does it have. So maybe you have some kind of self-efficacy instrument that has 10 questions that are used to measure self-efficacy. You'll want to talk about the response scale and the scoring for those instruments. So how do people respond to the items? Do they respond using some kind of a Likert scale, like a 5-point Likert scale or a 7-point Likert scale? That ranges from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So how are they responding to the items? And then how is the instrument scored? So say you have a 10 item instrument for self-efficacy. Are you just taking the responses to those 10 items and averaging them together, or summing them together to get an overall score for self-efficacy? Or are you scoring the instrument in some other way? And for each instrument, you want to provide evidence for the instrument's validity and reliability. And this information can usually be found in the research article that describes the original creation and development of the instrument. So for validity, you will usually want to describe the results of something like a factor analysis. So maybe past researchers did an exploratory or a confirmatory factor analysis to statistically validate their survey instrument. And then for reliability, you'd be looking at something like a Cronbach's alpha for inter-item reliability for a survey instrument, or something like test-retest reliability, which would be a correlation coefficient. And again, this type of information is typically found in the original article that describes the development of the instrument. And it's also important to note that all these things can be discussed in the instrumentation section. Sometimes schools will actually have separate sections dedicated to validity and reliability, where you'd want to discuss the evidence for each instrument's validity and reliability in those separate sections. So now let's talk about data collection procedures. And this is the part of the methodology chapter where, again, you want to go into a lot of detail and be specific and just describe step by step how the data are going to be collected. And so this should really just be from start to finish, the steps that you are going to take to conduct your research. And again, it should be detailed enough so that someone else could read it and be able to repeat these procedures exactly the same way that you are carrying them out. And so usually this starts with, right after you get institutional review board approval for your study, what's the very first thing that you're going to do in order to start your data collection. So you can start from there and then go through all the steps that you're going to have to go through up until the point where you have the data collected and are ready to analyze it. So all of those steps in between should be described in your data collection procedures. So you'll want to talk about things such as where and how the data collection is going to take place. So if you're doing a survey study, is this going to be in person or online? So are you going to, if we're doing that education study on teachers, are you going to be going into the schools and giving out paper and pencil surveys to the teachers, or mailing them surveys? Or are you going to be emailing them the surveys, like a link to an online survey where they can just take the survey on their own time? Then how are participants are going to be provided informed consent? So informed consent is an important process in the research where participants are given information about the nature of the research so they can make an informed decision of whether to participate or not. That needs to be done before you collect any data from participants. So you'll want to describe the process for how participants are going to provide consent. If you're doing an online survey, usually this just involves having an informed consent page at the beginning of your survey that describes the study, gives that information to participants so then that they can decide if they want to continue with the survey or not. You want to talk about things such as how and when each instrument is going to be administered. This is especially important if you're doing something like a longitudinal study or any kind of repeated measure study where you need to collect data from people at multiple points in time, like a pre-test, post-test study. So you'll want to describe, how many times participants will be taking the instruments and when exactly those instruments are going to be administered. And one thing that is important to note as well that we haven't discussed yet is so far this discussion has been geared towards primary data collection, assuming that you are going to be going out and collecting your own data. However, sometimes you may be doing a study where you use secondary or pre-existing data and conducting a new analysis on that data as part of your dissertation. So your data collection procedures are going to look a little bit different if you are doing an analysis of secondary data. When you're doing secondary data analysis, you'll want to describe more of the process for how you are obtaining that pre-existing data set. So you may need to go into detail about where you're obtaining the data. So is there some organization that that keeps the data or collects it, and you're going to get permission from that organization to use it? Or are the data publicly available somewhere? And if so, where are you obtaining that from? So you'll want to go into more details about the procedures that you need to follow to obtain and use those data, more so than the actual data collection process. You may want to describe some details about how the data were originally collected, but more of your focus should be on how you are obtaining the data and using it in your study if you're doing an analysis of secondary data. So after you go through all your data collection procedures, you'll also want to talk about your data analysis plan. So you'll have to do some kind of statistical analysis if you're doing a quantitative study in order to answer your research questions. And in your methodology chapter, you will want to lay out a very specific plan for how you intend to analyze the data to answer your research questions. And so by the end of this section, you should have a very specific plan for how you are going to answer each research question, or analyze the data in a way that you'll arrive at an answer for each research question. And so you want to start by describing how the data are going to be compiled or entered into an electronic format. And this is especially important if you're doing physical data collection, such as paper and pencil surveys, where you have to manually enter the data into an electronic format. So you'll want to describe that process. You'll want to state the software that you're going to be using for the data preparation and analysis. So you may be using something like SPSS, or we have our own software, Analysis Statistics, that you could use. And you want to describe how exactly you're going to clean or prepare the data for the analysis. So this can involve things like screening responses for eligibility. So you want to make sure that all the responses that you received, especially if you're doing something like an online survey study, you want to make sure all the responses that you received are from eligible participants. So if you're doing that study on high school teachers in the US, you want to make sure you screen out anyone that you can't identify as being a high school teacher. And you want to describe how you are going to clean up the data or check it for things like accuracy and missing values. So again, checking the data for accuracy is especially important if you have to manually enter in data from paper and pencil surveys. You want to be able to double check that data and make sure all the values were entered accurately. You want to make sure you have a plan for how you're going to handle missing data. So again, if you're doing a survey study, it's very likely that you'll have missing data. So people may just decide in the middle of the survey that they don't want to continue, or they may skip some questions, or for a variety of other reasons, they may not have complete responses. So you're going to have a plan for how you're going to deal with those missing data values. So are you going to just completely exclude any participant that has any values missing? Or are you going to try to include participants that have missing values? And if so, how are you going to deal with the missing values? Are you going to try to replace them or impute them in some way? So you'll want to describe those procedures. Then after you describe how you are cleaning and preparing the data, you want to describe any descriptive statistics you're going to conduct. So usually you would conduct descriptive statistics on any demographic information that you collect, as well as descriptives for your research variables, so all the variables listed in your research questions. And then you'll want to describe the specific statistical analysis that you're going to use to answer each research question or hypothesis. So, if your research question involves something like comparing groups on some variable, maybe you're going to do something like a t-test or an analysis of variance or an ANOVA. If your research questions involve looking at relationships between variables, maybe you're going to do some kind of a correlation like a Pearson correlation. Or if your research question involves predicting an outcome, maybe you're going to do something like a regression. So you'll want to, for each research question, state what analysis you're going to do to answer that question, and state the specific statistics that you're going to calculate in order to answer that question from that analysis. So if you're doing something like a t-test, you might report the t-value, the degrees of freedom, the p-value that you use to determine statistical significance, and some kind of measure of effect size, like Cohen's d. If you're doing a regression, maybe you're going to report the f-test for your regression, the r-squared, or percentage of variance explained, and then results for individual regression coefficients. And for each analysis that you plan to do, you will have to describe the assumptions for that analysis. So virtually all inferential analyses have certain statistical assumptions that need to be met in order for us to be able to accurately interpret the results of those analyses. So for instance, if you're doing something like a t-test, you may need to test the assumptions of normality and homogeneity of variance. And so for each analysis, you want to describe the assumptions that need to be tested, how you're going to test those assumptions, and what you're going to do if any of those assumptions are violated. So for the t-test, again, you may need to test normality and homogeneity of variance. So you want to describe how you're going to test normality. Are you going to do it by looking at a histogram? Or are you going to use something like a Shapiro-Wilk test? Are you going to be looking at skewness and kurtosis values? Or are you going to use a combination of those things? And then if you find that the assumption of normality is violated, you'll want to describe your plan for how you're going to deal with that. So are you going to try to transform the data in some way so that the data are closer to normal? Or are you going to use an alternative test like a non-parametric test in order to account for the fact that the assumption is violated? So you'll want to describe all of those steps in your data analysis plan. So one of the last sections of the methodology chapter that your school may want you to include may be limitations. So you may also have a limitations section earlier in your paper, maybe in the introduction chapter where you discuss limitations of your study. This may be an expansion of that section, or these may be limitations that are more specific to your research design and research procedures. So you'll want to list the specific limitations of your research design or any other limitations that are specific to your data collection procedures. And different quantitative research designs will have generally different limitations associated with them. So for instance, in correlational research, the main limitation of correlational research is that we cannot determine cause and effect between variables. We can only establish if there are relationships, but we can't necessarily determine if one variable is causing changes in another variable. If we're doing a survey study, then you may need to talk about different types of response bias. So there might be something like selection bias or social desirability bias that you have to deal with when you are conducting survey research. If you're doing some kind of a longitudinal or repeated measure study, so something that involves like a pre-test or post-test, there are specific limitations associated with those types of studies, such as attrition, testing effects, history, and maturation effects. In experimental research, the limitations may be more centered around concerns about external validity. So how can you be sure that the results of your experiment will generalize to real-world contexts? And so for your limitations, you want to list the limitations that are relevant for your research design. And if possible, describe any procedures that you're going to follow in order to mitigate those limitations as much as possible. So for instance, if you are doing a survey study and one of your concerns is social desirability bias or some kind of expectancy effect, then you may describe how you're going to ensure participants that the survey is anonymous or that their responses will be kept confidential so that you'll be more likely to elicit honest responses from the participants. And then usually one of the last, if not the last section of the methodology chapter is the discussion of ethical issues. So in this section, you want to describe all of the different ethical issues that are relevant to your study. And usually this is centered around discussion of Belmont Report Principles. So the Belmont Report laid out principles that researchers should follow in order to conduct ethical research. And this usually involves the general principles of beneficence, justice, and respect for persons. So your school may want you to describe these different principles and how you are going to uphold them in your study. You'll want to talk about institutional review board or IRB approval in this section. So usually just the fact that your study will need IRB approval, that you are going to get IRB approval before you collect any data. You'll want to talk about informed consent. You may already talk about that a little bit in your data collection procedures, but you may also want to discuss it here. So how participants are going to be provided informed consent. You'll want to talk about the risks involved in your study. So some students will make the mistake of saying that their study does not involve any risk, but that's not really true because all research studies involve some kind of risk. It's just sometimes the risks are considered minimal, or in other words, no greater than what participants may be expected to experience if they were just going about their daily lives and not participating in the study. But sometimes the risks are more than minimal. Whatever the case may be, you want to describe what the possible risks are and how you're going to mitigate them in your study. And this discussion becomes more important and detailed if your study involves more than minimal risk. So if you're doing some kind of research where participants have an elevated chance of experiencing, physical, emotional, or psychological harm, you want to describe, what those potential risks are and what you are going to be doing to minimize the chances of them experiencing those adverse effects as much as possible. You'll want to talk about how you're going to protect participants' identities and information. So if you're doing an online survey study, for instance, are participants' data going to be anonymous? So are you going to collect any identifiers? If you are collecting identifiers, how are you going to separate that from the data, and how are you going to keep the data protected and confidential? So for electronic data, are you going to be storing this in encrypted or password protected storage? If it's physical data like paper and pencil surveys, are you going to be keeping those surveys locked in a secure location? And then how are the data going to be disposed of after your study is over? So usually schools will have requirements for how long you are supposed to keep the data um, after the conclusion of your research. And then after a certain period of time, the data should be destroyed. And so you'll want to refer your school's guidelines for how long you should keep the data and what procedures you should follow for disposing of the data. And so that brings us to the end of the presentation on the components of the methodology chapter. And like we said before, if you are interested in additional support outside of this webinar, you can use the information that you see here to contact us and learn more about the different services that we provide related to the dissertation. But now I'll go ahead and get into the question section. So if you do have any questions, you can feel free to enter those into the question section now, and I will do my best to answer your questions. It doesn't look like we have any questions entered in already, so you can just go ahead whenever you would like. If you have a question, go ahead and type that into the question section now. We did have just one question about the recording, and the recordings of all of our webinars are available um, on our website, so you'll be able to see those and get a copy of the recording of the presentation if you want. So one question is the limitation the same as the scope and delimitation? So that's a good question, because those are actually different things. Limitations are things specific about your research procedures or design that may be, you could consider them weaknesses or flaws in the study. But a delimitation is a specific choice that you make about the scope of your research. So again, an example of a limitation might be, if you're doing correlational research, a limitation of that is that you can't make conclusions about cause and effect, and that's just a limitation of the design you have chosen. However, a delimitation has to do with your choice to limit the scope of the study in some way. So if we go back to our example of our population, and maybe we're doing that study on high school teachers in the US, you are specifically delimiting your research question or your population to high school teachers in the United States. So you have made the choice to limit the scope of your study to only high school teachers in the US. Your study is not going to be about high school teachers or teachers, in other parts of the world, or teachers at levels other than high school. Like, your study is not going to be about college teachers or middle school teachers. So those would be examples of delimitations. Those are specific choices that you're making to limit the scope of your study, and you may need to provide rationale for why you are making those choices to establish the scope of your research. So another question is, how do you determine sample size if you don't have data on population size? So in a quantitative study, depending on the specific procedures your school wants you to follow to determine sample size, you may not need information about the population size to establish your sample size. Because usually what you do for a quantitative study to determine sample size is to do a power analysis. And that won't be based necessarily on the size of the population, but it will be based on the specific statistical analysis that you plan to conduct. So, say you are planning to conduct a regression analysis. So you might conduct a power analysis for a regression, and there might be parameters that you input, such as, your level of statistical significance, the desired level of statistical power, the number of predictors in your regression, and so on, to calculate the number of participants you need for that regression analysis. And that's called a power analysis. Again, this presentation is not geared towards providing specific details about power analysis, because we do have other webinars that specifically are geared towards sample size calculation and power analysis. So if you do want more information about that topic, you can check out our other webinars that discuss power analysis. So another question is delimitation the same as inclusion and exclusion criteria? Your delimitations can be related to your inclusion and exclusion criteria, but it's not necessarily the same thing, because delimitations are more general in that, your delimitations can be about the scope of the population that you're studying. It could also be related to the scope of the variables that you're studying. So, you may pick certain variables to include and examine in your research, and you might be excluding, other variables. Those would be examples of delimitations to your research as well. So your delimitations can be related to what you establish as your inclusion and exclusion criteria, but it's not necessarily the same thing, because delimitations are a bit broader and can refer to more than just that. Okay, so if there are any other questions, feel free to type those into the question section now, and I'll give another minute or so for any other questions to come in. To answer the question of will there be webinars in November, I believe we do have webinars scheduled for November. So if you do look at our website that lists our upcoming webinars, you can find out what we are offering for that month. All right, it looks like there aren't any additional questions coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and end our presentation there for today. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending the webinar today. I hope this was helpful to you. Again, if you are interested in additional support, you can use the information that you see here to contact us and learn more about how we can help you. And also, again, look at our website for our upcoming webinars. You can also look at recordings of previous webinars to see what we've done in the past and see what's coming up in the future. But again, thanks everyone for attending. I hope everyone found this useful, and I hope everyone has a great day.